Come the 1990s, both Aston Martin and Jaguar were owned by the US car giant Ford. The luxury sporting British car makes offered very similar products. Cue the mid-noughties when you have these, the Aston Martin DB9 and the Jaguar XKR, both offering very similar propositions. But which one did it best? Lucas and I are going to take a drive and find out.
So, welcome to the Aston Martin DB9. Now, this thing was the replacement to the DB7, and you might have noticed they skipped a number there. They skipped 8. Now, the DB7 was based largely, obviously, on the XJS, right? So it shared a powertrain, it shared a platform, all that sort of thing. And by 2003, it was rather dogged, rather aged, I think we can all say.
Arguably it was aged when it came out, but that's
I think it
story.
was aged when it came out too, but a lot of people like the DB7, so I don't want to
It's very
poo-poo on it
beautiful.
too much.
The DB7 is a lovely
I'd say
looking
it's
car.
classically beautiful, yes. Aside from the wheels, I'm not a massive fan of the wheels, but the general shape, I think this inherited a lot of it. Now, speaking of that general shape, it was also designed by Ian Callum. It was his first project at Aston Martin just before this. They moved on a lot from that towards this. It was built in a brand new factory.
Yes, they set up at Gaydon, didn't they?
Yes,
so
they did.
This wasn't, the DB7 was built at Bloxham, I believe, in Oxfordshire, whereas this was built at Gaydon at their new purpose-built facility.
Brand new purpose-built facility, all new production techniques, bonded aluminium chassis, aluminium and composite body panels. So it was 25% lighter than the outgoing DB7, and yet it was twice as torsionally rigid, which is phenomenally impressive. Yeah, so it was a massive step forward. It was built on Ford's VH platform, so vertical being they wanted it to share the same production techniques as the rest of the cars on the platform, so similar to your XJR and similar to the VW Vantage that was built on it later.
So I read somewhere that Aston were going to do two particular sports cars. They were going to do a replacement for the DB7 and then some sort of mid-engined Ferrari chaser. But I think it was all Rick Bez that came in and said, we're never going to be able to afford that. So just focus on doing one thing well.
There was a lot of talk back then.
So,
but they did one thing pretty damn well as far as I'm concerned. This thing has turned out phenomenally. But back to what I was saying, the horizontal part of that being they would share a lot of the same parts from other cars. So this has very similar suspension to the VW Vantage, which came after it, and it just made everything a little bit more economically sensible to produce, which for Aston Martin at that time, just before they came under Ford ownership, was very much necessary. And everything came together, I think, pretty well. This is a really lovely place to be, and it's very rigid and it drives very well.
You can tell this has been built with fewer compromises compared to the DB7. Like, it's just the overall design and construction is so much nicer. I think this interior is much better than the DB7.
Oh yes, it's a lot less plasticky. I mean, everything is drenched in acres of leather and wood. It doesn't have it on the doors. Some models had it on the doors, but this is predominantly in the centre console. But it's a lovely place to be, and it was really a massive step up in the build quality, both on the outside and on the inside. Now, that's not to say that it didn't come with its fair share of issues, which, you know, most British cars do, of new and old. But this was one of the better examples.
So it's got a 6-litre V12, which is, strictly speaking, not 6 litres. It's 5.9.
So it's 5.9 litres, yeah. Aston Martin loved to do a little bit of rounding up back in the day. And contrary to popular belief, it is not 2 Ford Duratec V6s stuck together.
Yes, I saw that myth, yeah.
It was developed in partnership with Ford, who also, you know, were in cahoots with Cosworth, as they have been since the dawn of time. And they put together a lovely bit of kit. This is 450 horsepower in its launch guise. It went all the way up to, I think, the low to mid 500s in the later years.
Yeah, I think 2009 there was a facelift. It went up to about 470 horsepower.
Yes, there was. And then it went above 500, I think, after that in the...
Yeah, I think about 2013 they went to 510.
Yes, they did. But I mean, it's naturally aspirated, so the power delivery is where it's at.
It's rapid.
It's absolutely blistering.
It sounds amazing.
It sounds glorious, and it's you have a lot more power these days from some of the turbocharged and hybrid systems that are out there, but it's all about that power delivery. 450 is not a massive number by today's standards, but it's backed up by that 420 pounds-feet of torque number, which means it just shifts, and that progressive delivery and development of power, it starts and then it builds and it just kind of keeps on going until you hit redline and then on to the next gear and it just pulls away again. There's no waiting for turbos to spool up, there's none of that, and it's effortless. I think is the key term here. I mean, not necessarily in a Rolls Royce kind of way, because this is a still, I mean, it'll crush continents, but it's still a sportier angle of that sort of car.
You can tell it's firmer than the XK.
Oh yeah, yeah, it definitely
by far.
It definitely is.
And I believe it's got conventional power steering as opposed to electric power steering.
I think I might have to double check on that, but I believe it is still hydraulically assisted power steering as opposed to the e-Pass on the XJ. Which is, I mean, it lends a lot more feeling, as most hydraulic power assisted steering systems will, as opposed to the electric options. And you know, it's direct, but it's still, you are completely aware of what's going on the road underneath you, but it's never going to beat you up. You've still got that nice, relatively speaking, long wheelbase, especially in a coupe. And if you want it to, it will just take you for hundreds and hundreds of miles, no questions asked, to be honest. Now, it's almost impossible to sit in an Aston Martin and not bring up, you know, the gentleman spy, James Bond himself. But contrary to relatively popular belief, this was never actually a Bond car. In the contemporary Bond films that came out at the same time as this car, Bond actually drove the V12 Vanquish, or the Vanquish S. This car did appear in a Bond film. It appeared in Spectre, if memory serves, but only as an Easter egg sitting in Q's lab. It was never actually a Bond car, which is insane.
You're going to invite a load of comments now from all the Bond aficionados.
Yeah, I may have got one or two of those details wrong, but I know for a fact that this was never an official Bond car. And that, I mean, that doesn't take anything away from it. It's still a gorgeous V12 powered GT continent crusher extraordinaire.
Although this makes use of aluminium and magnesium, I think, in certain places, and composite materials, so it's super lightweight compared to the DB7. It's still a couple of 100 kilos heavier than the XK, I believe.
Yes, it's not light by any stretch of the imagination. It started in the low 1700 kilo range, and when you consider it's got, 450 horsepower, it doesn't sound like a lot of horsepower per ton. But again, it's not all about outright acceleration. I mean, this car started offering just the automatic gearbox, which is, you know, standard torque converter automatic transaxle, so the weight distribution is on point. But it was never meant to be, you know, an out-and-out sports car. But then Aston Martin sort of realised that
there was a manual, wasn't there? But
there was, but it came later. I think it was a year or two after the car was launched, the manual came along, because they realised, yes, this is a GT car, but we are sitting at the sportier end of the GT car market. Let's give the people what they want. Now, people wanted that on paper. I'm sure it was, you know, maligned by journalists at the time because, you know, no manual, where's our manual? But once it did eventually come along, it made up approximately 5% of sales, and I think that's across 16,000 cars or thereabouts. So it really wasn't making a lot of sense for them to be including it.
There's a lot of bravado around manual gearboxes, and let's be honest, when you've got this much power and this much torque, you don't need to be sort of stirring the gearbox every 5 seconds.
Now, speaking of cars that do a similar thing to this, it might be worth mentioning the contemporary V8 Vantage, which came out the year after this did, actually. Now, that car, I think, actually looks a bit better than this does.
The proportions look better. I like the diminutive proportions compared to this. This looks bulkier.
I mean, we've got that essential pinch point behind the front axle where the bonnet tapers in towards the bottom of the windshield, and I think that looks good here. And this is a longer-legged car, but on the Vantage, I just think the compact nature of it makes those accents just look a little bit better. And you've got the ducktail spoiler, which didn't come onto this car until I think it was the second facelift in the 2010s. Which isn't to say this is an ugly car by any stretch of the imagination, because I think it's arguably one of the best looking cars to come out of the 21st century so far.
I think it's good. I like its looks, and I think it's slightly more accomplished than the X150. Certainly the facelift car that we've got of the Jag, it's got some slightly fussy accoutrements by the time it gets this, where this has got it's got a muscular, taut stance, which I think looks really good and has aged really well, bearing in mind this is a 17-year-old car now. This particular example.
Yeah.
The interior packaging on both is still not brilliant. You know, the rear seats on this Volante model are...
It's very much a 2+2.
I mean, store some pizza boxes back there maybe, but that's about it.
I think it serves as a purse shelf.
Yeah.
These front seats, I mean, they're in good nick, don't get me wrong, but you can definitely tell that they've been sat in over the last 32,000. Oh, we just crossed actually 32,000 miles exactly, almost. Whereas those back seats are pristine, absolutely. I don't even think a child has been sat in that before, which really goes to show how they're not really very practical. Now, speaking of practicality, the coupe of this car does have a tiny boot because of those rear seats. This with the retractable soft top that we've got, even less space. I put my Pelican case that I use for all the camera gear in there, and it pretty much filled the entire thing up. I don't even think there's enough space for the industry standard bag of golf clubs. Another thing with practicality, granted, if you have the money for a V12 GT Continent Crusher, you probably don't care that much about fuel mileage, especially considering we're dealing with classic cars here. Fuel mileage has never really been on the list of priorities. But this will do a staggering, at absolute best on a long journey, this will do 20 miles to the gallon.
Wow. And
this is it's a 21st century car. And yes, it's a 6-litre V12, but still 20 miles to the gallon is
I'm pretty confident the Jags V8 will do better.
I hope
better mileage than that.
I hope so. But then, when you're listening to this, I don't know how much it matters.
Yeah, I don't think you're worrying too much about the planet when you're having fun like that, that's for sure.
Lord knows I'm enjoying myself, that is for damn sure. But I think it might be time for us to hop over into the Jag and see what that's all about.
Well, we're already fairly at home, by the way. I'd just like to point out there's a lot of familiar switchgear. These stalks are straight from an X-Type. And actually, the XK and the DB9 share the same mirror and window switches. But
I don't know how much that's Aston's fault so much that it is our good friends over at
Listen, it all works, so no one should complain. It does all work, and the design holds together very nicely. But
I think so.
Yeah, like you say, let's hop into the more contemporary and V8 powered Jaguar XKR and see what it's like. So Lucas, this for me is a really underrated sporting GT, the X150 Jaguar XK. As ever with Jaguar, it was never quite as simple because they introduced the X150 XK at the tail end of 2005, or unveiled it at the tail end of 2005. And the company was in a bit of turmoil at this point because about a year earlier they just announced the closure of the Browns Lane factory.
Right.
So this was built at Castle Bromwich, not Browns Lane, so the first sports car not to be built at Browns Lane. And and they'd also pulled out Formula One, so all their sporting credentials had been put on the shelf. So they really needed a win, and they kind of previewed the launch of the X150 with something called an ALC sort of concept car, which was basically just this with a few fancy bits of jazzy jewellery.
Bigger wheels,
and they unveiled that at the Detroit show in 2005. So after all the sort of negative news at the tail end of 2004, they wanted to start 2005 on a high. And it was also Ian Callum's first bit of penmanship since joining Jaguar in 2001. So the X350 had been signed off before he joined, actually, so he couldn't really affect the design of the big saloon. The XK was his first major project for Jaguar. So I think he managed to really sort of free himself from the shackles of the previous generation XK, which of course was based on the XJS.
Yes.
And consequently, I think we've got a much more contemporary design. I think the proportions of this car are fabulous, and crucially, the packaging is very good as well. It's got much more leg room, more shoulder room. I mean, in an X100, we'd practically be like Siamese twins, wouldn't
together,
we?
It was also, the DB9 was his second project at Aston Martin as well after the DB7. So it explains why they bear quite similar looks. I mean, obviously they're from a similar era and they're on pretty much the same platform, but same designer, two sister companies under the same umbrella at Ford. It makes a lot of sense.
This is it. Ian Callum started designing the DB9 before he designed this, but of course they're very similar. Now, he takes that criticism head on. I've seen interviews, and in fact I've interviewed him about it before, and he makes no apologies about it, because he says to some extent how a sports car looks in this era was governed by legislation. There was all sorts of protocols they had to abide by.
Always will be.
I remember that this car got a bit of stick for its slightly longer pronounced snoot compared to the X100. But again, part of that was because there was legislation about having enough of a gap between the bonnet and the engine beneath it. So they tried to lower the bonnet, but they can do that by extending the nose cone a bit. And then they've got these fancy hydraulic rams that pop up if it did sort of hit a pedestrian.
It's all pedestrian safety stuff. The hood comes up a bit, doesn't it?
Exactly. So, I think yes, I think some of the angles might be not quite as accomplished as the previously curvaceous X100, but I think the overall proportions are excellent. I love the sort of rear haunches of this, particularly on the coupe. And you look at the glass area on the coupe as well, it's very reminiscent of the E-Type.
It's a lot meatier, I think, and it really gives that real British muscle look to it.
And whereas the DB9, of course, had the V12, this always had V8s.
Four fewer cylinders, but doesn't really sound much worse in its defence, does it?
No, exactly. It was 4.2 normally aspirated and supercharged to begin with, so 300 and 400 brake. This particular example is a 2009 spec one with the latest 5-litre Gen 3 AJ V8 engine. So we've got about, I think, 380 horsepower from the normally aspirated one, and this being the supercharged one, we've got 500. So
which is plenty then.
We're not short of horses under the bonnet, and it's quite a torquey unit as well. So it's really effortless the way it burbles along.
I feel that's something that both powertrains have quite similar, is the way that they deliver the power.
Yes.
Especially from that V12. Granted, it's only 450 horsepower, but it's also 420 pounds-feet of torque.
Yes.
And it's so smooth. I mean, naturally aspirated, whether this is supercharged or NA, it's still pretty linear. There it is. And what a soundtrack to go with it.
It's got one of those trick exhausts with the
flaps
that opens up on full chat, so you can really explore that.
Good neighbour mode and bad neighbour
exactly
mode.
Exactly. Yeah, they've got the sort of proper oral theatre that you get when you open up the throttle a bit. It's absolutely glorious.
I'll give you that.
I know the interior. Again, Callum told me that I think there were some people in Jaguar that thought the interior was a bit dull, and some road testers did comment on the time, because this lovely dramatic swoopy shape, and the interior is probably functional, I would say. Again, this being a facelift car, it's slightly better, better appointed. It's got the switch gears being upgraded by this point, and you get the rotary gear knob instead of the J gate.
Is this one of the ones that sinks into the dash, or is
it does? It sinks into the centre console. I think it works very well, and it's very well screwed together actually as well, which is the other thing.
I mean, from a materials perspective, it is still gorgeous. Granted, from a styling perspective, it's simple, and I mean everything works, which is good, especially for a Jag, if you don't mind me saying.
No, exactly. And the ergonomics are good as well. Like these dials in front of me are beautiful. They're sort of crystal clear. The stalks are easy to hand. I've got the paddle shift for the gearbox. I've got to say, I don't really use the paddles that much. I'm no Lewis Hamilton or Lando Norris or whatever we want to call it.
At the end of the day, it's still a torque converter automatic anyway, isn't it?
But
so
you've got the option.
Of course.
You've got the option, I suppose, is the point. And the touchscreen is fairly early tech by this point. I think it's better than the system that's in the DB9, to be honest, because the DB9 is a couple of years earlier than the X150 XK.
Yes.
But by modern standards, this feels quite ponderous, and the graphics are a little bit sort of ZX Spectrum. But I think the interior actually overall is much better than I think some people made out, and I think it's a very polished affair.
I think it may be simple, but it's still a Jag, and it's still a gorgeous place to be, and there's no complaints as far as that goes.
No, absolutely. I think the tragedy, Jaguar was always blighted by bad timing, right? So, obviously there was the bad timing of closing Browns Lane and pulling out of Formula One. That was bad timing number one. Just when they finally get this car on the market, bearing in mind it wasn't really on sale until 2006. What happens at the tail end of 2007? The global financial crisis.
Yeah, that'll do it.
So, the world is suddenly on its knees financially, and therefore the idea of trying to sell a kind of £80,000 luxury sporting GT is certainly that much harder. And I think that was one of the challenges. So the X150 never really replicated the sales success of its predecessor either. I think there was not quite 100,000 X100s shifted in its 10-year life between 96 and 2006, whereas I think this did just shy of 55,000 in its 8-year life from 06 to 2014. Probably not helped by the fact that also it overlapped the F-Type for about a year and a half or so.
It did do that, didn't it? I mean, it played more of a GT role in that respect. The F-Type was a lot more sports focused than I think this may have been at the time.
But I think therein lies for me the appeal of the X150. I just think it's such a fantastic all-rounder. I think it does have sporting pretensions, probably more so than the X100 that it replaced, because it's a bit firmer, bit more rigid. That aluminium architecture gives it rigidity, and although it's a much bigger car, it's not that much heavier, so that's a credit to it.
This is true.
And so it feels sporty when it wants to be, but it's effortless when you don't, and you can just cruise along. You can cover long distances at 5/10, or you can hustle along a B road at 9/10 if you wish.
I think that is what both of these cars are about. At the end of the day, they're both just continent crushers that do have that sporting edge to them if you want it.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you're going to sit here and you're going to be relaxed, and you're going to go for mile after mile after mile.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so yeah, I really like these, and as ever, they kind of steadily evolved over the 8-year life cycle. So by the time you get to a 2014 car, it's just subtly different. The later cars have got different headlights, different sort of LED headlights, and a new side grille design from about 2011 that's not dissimilar to the DB9s, actually.
This is actually quite true.
So they look very similar, which is quite amusing. But yeah, I think these are tremendous. I really do. I think they're a fantastic car. Just on sale at the wrong time, arguably, so it didn't really have the sales success that it deserved, because it's a better car than the X100, but it wasn't the commercial success of the X100.
Yeah, just what the market just wasn't ready for it when it came about.
Yes, of course.
It remained that way for much of its lifespan, unfortunately.
And by the time this one's on sale, Ford have ditched Jaguar. They've thrown it over the edge of the boat and sold it to Tata. So, you know, we're under new management by this point, and I think Tata were quite keen to develop a proper replacement to the E-Type, hence the F-Type that comes out in 2030, you know. But the bang for buck is definitely more in the Jaguar's favour, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's quicker, really, especially in the later models, and it costs a decent chunk less. Was it 10, 14?
This particular example, I think, is up for around £24,000, whereas the DB9 we've got here on test is
closer to 40.
Is about £39,000. So it's quite a big difference for arguably a very similar car. You're basically paying for the badge and 4 extra cylinders.
Yeah, that is true.
And I looked at the insurance costs. Our dear friends at Peter Best kindly sort of quoted on these two cars just as an exercise. And actually, they're not dissimilar. This is about 50 quid a year cheaper to insure, about 550 versus about 600 for the Aston Martin.
Less excess on this, though,
and a lower excess. Yes, that's right. 250 plays 350, but you know, obviously, it all boils down to personal circumstance. So,
of course,
yeah. So I think this is also better value. It's worth saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, I mean, bang for buck. There's no argument really. Personally, I still do enjoy the shape of the Aston a little bit more. But again, they're very similar looking to most people. I think this probably won't turn as many heads if that's what you're into, but if you're buying a classy GT, I don't think that's quite your bag anyway. Yeah. So this one probably takes the cake, all things considered.
But yeah, do let us know in the comments, which one would you take home? The Jaguar XKR in its X150 guise, or the Aston Martin DB9? Maybe it's none of the above. Maybe you want to go for a DB7, or you want to go for the X100 Jaguar XK.
But whatever your decision is, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will talk to you very soon.
Thanks for watching. It's not, oh, it was showing hot as well, actually.
Oh, thanks for that.
Let's get the intro done.